Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'll go ahead and get us started as people start trickling in. I'm Karthikeyan. Thank you for joining us. This panel marks the end of the first quarter of my 2021 Chang Prize project, Intersections. It's a project that I imagined would explore the ways that recording and remembering community histories could inform, ground, and inspire new forms of solidarity building. But I wanted to begin that exploration with the community that I lived in for the last 4 years, specifically the community of Caltech, of organizers and advocates and activists and agitators who work to push for change. So this event follows a few months of oral history work, collecting a small handful of narratives from campus organizers, activists, and advocates who studied at Caltech over the decades. Those narrators include Tom Joven, a former undergrad who graduated in 1960, who worked with the Y to expand public service projects and served as ASCIP president. It also includes Edray Goins, who's sitting on this panel and who I'll let introduce himself in a little bit. And it includes Jennifer Karen Oldham, a former undergrad who graduated in 2002, who founded the Peaceful Justice Coalition at Caltech, led the Y as president, and started initiatives like Make a Difference Day. Their oral histories detailing their experiences and efforts at the Institute are in the process of being transcribed and added to the Caltech archives. And I'll ask you all to keep an eye out for them over the next several months. But as these histories were being shared with me, and as I started working at a really incredible community-based archive myself, it became really clear to me that community histories are most meaningful when they become part of their communities. When we have the chance to reflect on the people who were in our shoes before us, who understand the work that they did and that we've inherited, and conceive of new ways to build on their legacies. So this panel is, at its heart, an effort to embed those histories in our present moment and in our present community. In a few moments, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves by sharing artifacts from their personal histories at Caltech. But I'd like to muse a little on why I had to share artifacts in the first place. I'd like us to think about the ways that we remember Caltech and the ways that Caltech remembers itself. What are the things that define Caltech? The material objects that we create in our time at the Institute and take with us when we leave to mark what we have accomplished and to remember what we experienced. When I entered Caltech as an undergrad, I had a firm idea of what artifacts I expected to leave the university with. Lab notebooks and ditch day shirts and photos of blackboards with lecture notes I wasn't quick enough to jot down during class. In reality, the only lab I spent time in was the intro chem lab I had to take as a graduation requirement. I never did plan a ditch day stack. And while at one point I did have a phone full of Blackboard photos, they've since all been deleted. Instead, I wanted to share with you some of the artifacts that I do have. This is a collection of photos taken in May of 2018, after a student wrote in the tech sharing their experiences reporting their sexual assault and the outcomes of their Title IX investigation. There are photos from a candlelight vigil organized by some of my brilliant co-organizers in the Title IX Council, Ruhi and Donna and Rachel and Desi and others, and I, to demonstrate campus support for sexual assault survivors. There are others from a sit-in we organized in front of Parsons Gates to push for policy changes. And there's one from a petition we wrote detailing those requests. At the vigil, students signed messages of support for the article's author onto a collage of newspapers that you'll see in the middle. And they also created a link of chains seen on the top left that are color-coded to share individual experiences. The collage and chain were torn down by the next morning. But as I look back at these artifacts, I wonder what it would look like to remember Olive Walk, not just as a space that sleepy undergrads stumble out of to get to class, or even as a space for lawn parties when one of our faculty members wins a Nobel Prize, but as a site where a group of students came together to create art, write messages, and demonstrate support for campus community members who've experienced sexual assault and harassment. I wonder what it would mean to see Parsons Gates not just as a beautiful building full of offices and paperwork, but as a space once marked by signs reading "Believe survivors" and "Survivors deserve agency," and rape should not be part of the Caltech experience. I wonder what would change if we didn't have a Caltech Wikipedia page that read, "Protests by Caltech students are rare." I wonder what would happen if the buildings that mark our campus didn't bear the names and legacies of eugenicists. I wonder what Caltech would look like if we told new members of campus that they are not just inheriting legacies of science, but legacies of resilience, resistance, and community. I hope as our panelists share artifacts from their own histories at Caltech, and as we go through this panel and they share more of their experiences overall, you're able to see alternative paths at the Institute, and you're able to imagine new visions for its future. I'll turn it over to our panelists, though, to introduce themselves, beginning with Shelley. Oh, Shelley, you're muted.
Hello, my name is Rochelle Diamond, but my friends and my colleagues call me Shelley. I've been at Caltech for 37 years, and I'm currently the director of the Caltech flow cytometry cell sorting facility, where we service about 30 labs and around 100 research projects a year. But I'm also the laboratory manager for Dr. Ellen Rothenberg's developmental immunology lab in BBE. So who the heck am I? Well, my artifact, my life. I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona as a tomboy, as you can see on the left. And I had a real coming out as a debutante. And I married my best friend in high school, pretty much out of college, because he needed insurance. And our marriage lasted about 10 years. My second job was being one of the coordinating technicians for the team at City of Hope that cloned the human gene for insulin that started the entire biotechnology revolution. And it was national news. And it still to this day is an accomplishment that I cherish. And after that, I took a job in the lab next door working on protein sequencing instrumentation. But I was outed, I was sabotaged, and I was asked to leave my job. And it was after the worst day of my life, because it ended my marriage, that I joined a fledgling group of activists called the Los Angeles Gay and Scientists, a group of people who eventually started the national organization. I'm proud to be part of that. So meanwhile, back at Caltech, when I joined in 1982, I looked around for other gay and lesbian people, but they were really hard to find. I asked the Seismo lab for a tour for my Los Angeles group, and I discovered Dr. Kate Hutton, the earthquake lady, who let me know she thought she was one of us. So we became fast friends and worked together to find others like us on campus. We found people at JPL and started to have parade contingents every year at the West Hollywood Gay Pride Festival. And we had a booth selling cold water to thirsty people, where we met other scientists and engineers in the local Los Angeles area. Slide 2. So I'm not sure who or how the Caltech Lesbian and Gay Society, CLAG, started. But in 1984, I know we approached my Los Angeles group to help change the EEO policy, Equal Employment Opportunity Policy, that is, at Caltech and JPL, so that it would include sexual orientation. And by 1988, people at Caltech and JPL worked with the ACLU to survey Southern California scientific and technical companies on their policies and whether they knew the state law which prohibited discrimination. And the next year, we actually presented the results at a poster session at the American Association for the Advancement of Science annual meeting. And that kind of gave us courage. We worked with a number of people, but basically the Organization for Women at Caltech believed in us. And in 1990, the OWC, as it was known, agreed to sponsor a forum to discuss homophobia in the sciences. We tried to get JPL to advertise it in their universe, which is how people found out about activities at JPL, and they refused to run the ad on their TV in the cafeteria. So there was much back and forth with both Caltech and JPL administrators until it was finally listed. The meeting was held on an evening in Noyes Hall, and reporters from the Pasadena Star News and the LA Times came to listen to our stories. It was quite an evening and quite an event that started a lot of things going. Slide 3. So the following years, we were vocal. We were working on AIDS education, security clearance policies, computer privacy issues, diversity and inclusion, among other issues. And it took until 1994 to 95, can you just, next slide, after a lot of publicity, oh, back one, there you go, and a lot of talking to many community members for the policies to change for inclusion of LGBTQ people at Caltech and JPL. But we eventually got it done with the help of a lot of people and allies. Now slide 5. So I've been out and mentoring and being a force for change ever since that worst day of my life. But it was actually the best day of my life. And it changed my life forever. I never went to grad school, but here I am as member of the professional staff at Caltech. And I've been recognized as a AAAS fellow. I've received the Fred Scher Award from CCD. And here on the left, on this slide, is me giving a keynote speech to the National Science Foundation for their Pride Festival. So I really, I've cherished my time at Caltech and for letting them let me be who I am. And for my boss, Ellen Rothenberg, to let me be who I am. So that's my artifact, my life.
Thank you so much, Shelley. Thank you. I'll go ahead and ask Ed to jump in next.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Edray Goins, a professor of mathematics at Pomona College. I would like to introduce myself by showing off 3 identification cards. They each represent a different point in my life as it intersected with Caltech. I grew up in South Los Angeles, just 18 miles from Caltech. I knew at an early age, perhaps around age 13, that I wanted to attend Caltech. This dream came true in February of 1990 when I received my acceptance letter. I still have this letter to this day. I knew that I wanted to major in physics and to receive an education at the world's premier institution for theoretical physics. On your screen at the upper left, you'll see a photo of me as a freshman. This is actually from a Ditch Day stack in 1991. I was very active. I helped to restart the Black Student Union, although we called this the National Society of Black Engineers, or NSBE. During my 4 years as an undergraduate, I was quite interested in the history of the Black students on campus. In summer of 1993, I conducted a surf on the topic. I focused on 2 questions. 1, who were the first Black undergraduate and graduate students to graduate from the Institute? And second, what were the experiences of these students? In spring of 1994, during my senior year, I wrote a series of 10 articles for the student paper, the California Tech, which outlined my findings. I successfully graduated from the Institute in 4 years with a degree in mathematics and physics, winning awards in mathematics and history in the process. But I cannot say I enjoyed my experience at Caltech. I did not enjoy my time either in the mathematics or physics departments, and I promised myself that I would come back as a faculty member one day to help make it better for other students. In 2001, I came back as a postdoctoral fellow. Here in the upper right corner, you can see a photo of my ID card when I was a faculty member in the Department of Mathematics. From 2004 through 2018, I was a tenure stream faculty member, meaning assistant, associate, and full professor in the Department of Mathematics at Purdue University in Indiana. But in summer of 2007, I was offered the opportunity to return to campus to run the Office of Minority Student Affairs. I was the director of the Freshman Summer Institute, or FSI, which is the bridge program for underrepresented minority students. I attended the same program when I was a freshman, and I helped to design this program over the 15 years after I graduated. Here, in the bottom of your screen, you can see a photo of myself as a staff member working directly with the minority students. I've had a long and varied history with Caltech. Some of the experiences were heartbreaking and others endearing, but all were life-changing.
Thank you so much, Ed. I'll go ahead and ask Melany to jump in next.
So hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. So I'm Melany Hunt. I'm a faculty member in mechanical engineering, And I came to Caltech in 1988. What I'm sharing here today are some things that I've kept actually since 1989. So I've kept since my first year here at Caltech. And some of this actually overlaps with some of Shelley's recollections about the organization of women at Caltech. And so, you know, my memory back to 1989 is not great, but I did keep at the time a journal that I still have. I have several of them. And so some of my memories really are taken from my journal notes. And what I'm showing you here in the back is a copy of the California text from November 17th, 1989. And it was during this time, again, would have been the start of my second year at Caltech, when I was approached by a couple of students after an OWC event to see if I would be interested in participating in a petition that they were writing. And the petition or the origin of the petition was in the aftermath of a student party in one of the undergraduate student houses. The petition, however, was not intended to focus on the party itself, but to raise issues and raise awareness and concerns about some of the problems and struggles that women faced on the Caltech campus. And so the first line, and so this is there's actually a number of other letters that were submitted at the same time at the Caltech, but this is the petition here. And the first line of the petition was about the party. And the subsequent paragraphs were what we were trying to do in terms of raise awareness in terms of some of the larger issues at Caltech. So I'm just going to read you just a short bit from this petition. And so this is really then starting at the second line of the petition and not referencing directly referencing the party. So the purpose of this letter is not to define this incident, nor is it aimed at the single event. We would like to address subtle with office and discuss how day-to-day gender inequities can lead to an uncomfortable working environment and contribute to the possibility of incidents such as this one. The petition then goes on to talk about what we might now call microaggressions and unconscious bias, and describes how these effects place pressure on women to conform to roles that they might not wish to play and interferes with their ability to work effectively or to become leaders. And the petition was written really by a group of about 10 women. It was a mix of students, staff, and faculty. Back in 1989, we didn't have the internet in its current form. And so to get people to sign, we physically went around and asked people to sign. And so that whole process probably took about 2 weeks in terms of writing the petition and getting signatures. And again, it was an effort of about a dozen people or so going around asking people if they'd be interested in signing. We did make sure that the petition was seen by people in Parsons Gates. And about a day or two before we sent the petition to the tech, I was called into Parsons Gates and asked to meet with an individual in the administration who is very, very upset about the petition, particularly the first line that described the party. And so again, I was a new assistant professor. I sat there and listened, trying to interject and say that the petition was not written by me, but that it was a group effort. And the point of the petition was these larger issues and not about the party. But this individual was very concerned and told me quite clearly that they felt that I could make changes to this petition. And so this upper piece here, and my picture obscures part of it, but it was actually, he wrote out for me a first line of how he'd like the petition to be changed. I left the office, went back to my office, called a few of the women who had participated in writing the petition. No one had any interest at that point in time in making changes. By that point, we had about 230 signatures on the petition. And so I relayed that information back to Parsons Gates. And then, a few days later, it appeared along with several other letters in the tech. The outcome of that process was that there were a number of conversations on campus in the student houses. And this piece on the right here is still minutes of a faculty meeting back from that time where this was discussed. And, when I look back now, what's unfortunate is that the focus became the party, and that much of the discussion that was had on campus was not about the larger issues that we were trying to raise. It really was very much about what happened and who was responsible and what was going to change in terms of oversight of students within the houses. And that, again, was not the intent at all. So as I reflect back now, again, some of the things that were clearly written in that petition and clearly experienced by various women on campus are still part, I think, of what we continue to face here at Caltech. And so, Niv, if you just want to do the next slide here quick. This is, again, my more recent attempt to raise these issues. And this you can find on the Caltech webpage if you're interested. It's giving voice to caltech.edu. And it was done with a small bit of money from the National Science Foundation and some support from Caltech. And what I've been trying to do here is to, again, highlight experiences that individuals at Caltech might find themselves in that makes it an environment where there are struggles, where it makes it less comfortable for women or for gender non-conforming students to really be able to find a place. And so we've done now 5 different vignettes, and you can see those on the web. They've been written by a group by students and staff combinations. And we've also put up some supporting materials, trying to give people some ideas about how to deal with these situations, how to think about these problems, and really how to frame our lives, either in the classroom or in the laboratory, in a way that really is supportive of everyone. And so with that, Niv, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you all. Also, just how impressed I always am that you've all kept such good records. Maintaining personal archives is challenging, so I appreciate that you've all kept these artifacts. I'm going to stop sharing. With that, I'll ask us to jump into the panel portion of the event, and I'll note for the audience members, please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A feature of Zoom. We'll get to them at the end of the questions, but please feel free to start entering them at any point as we're discussing, and we'll go through them later. I'd like to begin, though, with a question on community. Specifically, how did you all find, build, and maintain communities on campus? And anyone should feel free to jump in.
Well, as I said, it was difficult in the beginning when I first got to Caltech in 1982. But finding an outside group like Los Angeles Gay and Lesbian Scientists really helped me and helped me steer people to that group. And then there was the LA Gay and Lesbian Center, which also helped all of us to have a nucleating event like the Gay Pride Festival to bring people together. And that really, I think, helped a lot of students and staff. But it was really, really hard to find professors. And even when I found out there were deaths from AIDS and things, and I was not allowed to go to the archives and read about these people who I knew were gay. So it was a long road to acceptance.
When I got to Caltech in fall of 1990, it was actually a very unique situation. Before I got there, the number of Black students coming in per year was dwindling down to roughly 1 or 2. I don't think that there were more than maybe 5 Black students on campus total as undergrads and grad students. I know that there were really no Black faculty on campus. So 1990 was very unique in that there were 14 Black undergraduates that all came in. For those that know the history, Lee Brown had just retired, Eddie Grotto had just started, he had come in from MIT. So we had a critical mass of students on campus. We're all very young, but a critical mass that wanted to do something. I have to credit Mbowe Kazadi and Sansa Kazadi for deciding that we really needed to have some type of a community now that all of the students were on campus at the same time. They wanted to establish a Black student union, but for political reasons, decided we were going to have a student chapter of the National Society of Black Engineers. It was a fledgling chapter. Most of us were not engineering majors. We had never heard of NSBE before, but we just knew that we needed to have some kind of community now that all of these students were on campus. It took us a couple of years to figure out what we were doing, what we wanted to do. But I think eventually the student chapter ended up being a real family for a lot of us. We would have barbecues on the weekends. We try to have welcome events for the pre-FOSH that have been admitted to campus. We welcomed undergraduates, grad students, staff people, grounds people that worked on campus. We really did whatever we could to kind of have that unique family feeling there on campus. And for me, it was something I was very proud of, but it was a lot of work. I really wish I could have come to campus and it was already there. But, you know, in addition to trying to double major in math and physics and do all of the rest of these things, we really had to work hard in just getting that community together, but it worked. We really did have a nice community.
Maybe I can just talk a little bit about tech at the time when I first started. So I started again in 1988, and I was the second woman on the faculty hired in engineering. The first woman was hired in 1987. And so at that point in time, the number of women on the faculty, again, it was 10 or 12, you know, something of that number. And my, the department manager of the building that I'm in, I still am in now, her name was Jackie Beard, and Jackie was a force. And Jackie was very involved with the Organization of Women at Caltech, and that was how I initially got involved. And so in the luncheon, it was the second week of fall term. I had given some introductory remarks. The speaker was Jenny Joy Lavelle. It was an audience of about 400 people. And OWC, it was a group of volunteers and largely people like Jackie, you know, staff members that were just really devoted and really wanted to make a difference. And that group was a group that then later advocated for having an ombudsperson on campus, for starting a women's center on campus, for increasing childcare on campus. It was, you know, this group that really spanned, you know, student, staff, faculty, postdocs, and was successful, I think, in really making change back then. And as you know, other groups evolved and student affairs evolved, where they then did have a women's center and did have the minority student education program. You know, some of this need to have volunteers doing this work kind of went away. And some of that work was then subsumed, you know, in some of the offices. At the same time, I think there's still always a place for activism on the Caltech campus. But it is good to see that those structures did eventually form, which again provide tremendous support. I should also note, back then there was no Title IX office. There was nothing of that sort supporting individuals. So.
It's funny, I think so many of the points that you've all raised are things that come up for so many activists and advocates at Caltech. This idea that, I know when I first came on Caltech, I was really hit over the head with the idea that Caltech is a bubble. We're a world unto ourselves. We operate in our own little close-knit special universe. And it's so clear that that's not true, just from what you were sharing, Shelley, with how pivotal it was for community members on Caltech to use and access external structures. And I think you were saying the same, Ed, with using the infrastructure of NSBE to build community. Another thing that you all touched on a bit, but I'd like to press a little more, was about your experiences collaborating across student, staff, and faculty lines. Caltech is unique because of its size. It's particularly small. One of the things that students like to know is how much access we have to adults or real adults on campus. And that's reciprocal, I think. Faculty and staff members also do interact with students a lot. What were your experiences kind of collaborating across those lines? What were some of the challenges? I know, Shelley, you did mention that it was difficult to coordinate between these different groups at times.
Well, I ended up being a mentor, having an open door policy. I had a nickname, the BDOC, the Big Dyke on campus. And a lot of times, this was before we had the Center for Diversity and the Women's Center. And I still actually mentor people who just don't want to be known other than just to have an ear. But I think that it was important for the Women's Center to come in. Kathleen Bartle-Schulweis really helped us. And she had been, I believe, the ombudsperson before that. But she got us to eventually have a space in the Center for Diversity where we actually had a lounge and could actually meet with people and actually have events, Christmas parties, whatever, that the entire campus was invited to. And we got to finally meet our community face to face. That was really, really important. But I remember that I was appointed by the provost, and so was Kate Hutton, to the first Women's Center board. And then the provost changed. And the first thing we knew after the provost changed was Kate and I were kicked off the board. They didn't want lesbians in the Women's Center. So that was another fight that we eventually, had, and Kathleen really intervened on our behalf. But just being able to move the library away from the music rooms in a locked cabinet to the center, was an open library and anybody could check out a book, was really significant to us.
Yeah, for us, working with the faculty and staff, I guess, was sometimes a blessing, sometimes a curse. Because there really weren't a lot of Black faculty, Black staff on campus, part of the issue was just figuring out who's around, who we could talk to. I know the person that eventually people told me that I should go talk to was Jean Reynolds. She worked, I believe, in geology, more or less as like secretary, but I think that she had been on campus longer than any other Black staff member at that point when I got there about the early 1990s or so. So it was great to talk to her just to kind of get an idea of like the history, what was happening, pitfalls that we should definitely be aware of. But I'll say that she was very instrumental in just having someone to talk to about just kind of the larger institutional things. It was kind of a curse in that I think that there were some individuals that I'm not going to name who were staff members who really thought that because they had been around Caltech for a very long time, they knew what was best for the minority students without really knowing the community that we had formed on campus. And I think that on the one hand, they really wanted to believe that they were allies, but they were really making our lives more difficult than perhaps they should have, just because there wasn't really any trust there. There wasn't much communication. I can definitely say that we were very much at odds with the administration for a lot of the time that I was at Caltech. One story I'll mention in particular was around Martin Luther King's birthday as a holiday. I can say I personally went to go talk to the president of Caltech at the time, Thomas Everhart, several times about just the concept of not having classes on that day. And I can say that he was very much against it. His reason being Caltech doesn't have holidays for other people, so it's not going to start with Martin Luther King. In my own frustration of not really knowing what to do, I would then sometimes go talk to various graduate students, people who are a little bit older, just to get an idea of politically how should all of this play out? I remember one day talking with Danny Howard, Jean Andino, and David Bean. It was one day after one of our NSBE meetings, I was extremely upset. I just decided I was going to storm into the president's office, essentially yell at him and say, this is the way that things should be. But I remember running into the three of them when I was almost to Parsons Gates. And they kind of calmed me down, just saying, no, politically, here's the right way to do this. Here's some things to be careful of. Here's a different way to think about it. And that, for me, being a young undergraduate, not really knowing about politics, was really very helpful. So, here we were, in the sense that we were an undergraduate organization, but because we did have those ties with staff, with the grad students, with the quote unquote adults, I think that really helped us politically to figure out how to move the agenda forward.
So I just want to echo some of the things that Ed and Shelley have said. For Caltech, forward motion really has come because of students and because of staff. And I had faculty say that, Caltech is run by the faculty. And I just, I think maybe in some areas of deciding which areas of science, that's probably true. But in terms of some of the things that we're talking about, it hasn't been the faculty. It's really been the students and the staff that have been able to move things forward. I think the challenge with the students is that they turn over every 4 years. And so that communication can sometimes be lost. And that's where, again, organizations like the Organization for Women at Caltech that was so heavily involved or engaged with the staff really was able to get things done because they had that memory and they could keep pushing, over a longer period than 4 years. But for me, the interactions, were probably somewhat different than what Ed and Shelley experienced. That again, after I made those comments at this luncheon in '89, people started coming to my office thinking that I could help them, that I could help solve their problems. And within, a week of that event, I had a student at my door. She was a young woman in engineering. She had just started at Caltech, and she showed me and told about being on Caltech's campus, and really the harassment that she received from a faculty member. Back then there wasn't places to turn to, and so it took me a while to find the people like Ed's talking, like people like Jean Grinnells that I could send other people to help solve some of these, because I really wasn't sure how to solve it. Again, the women that came to me about the party, again, it was because of the OWC luncheon, that that there were not clear offices, clear support structures. And so if you saw someone that said things that sounded like they maybe could empathize with what you're going through, I think they sought you out. And yet, I didn't have any special skills to deal with these issues, no real talents. It took me a while to kind of figure things out myself in terms of how to respond, how to support people, where to go to. And that's where, when Caltech finally did hire an ombudsperson, start a women's center, start an office of minority student education, it was really important because at least there were people there that were there in a professional way, that had some background and could probably support students or support staff more effectively than what individual faculty could at that time.
I'd like to echo that. In the Title IX office, at least when I was working in the council and a part of that there, we had the best staff members. And the staff really kept the office running. And I think at least with undergrads, and I'm guessing with graduate students too, there is a real anxiety about, oh, we're only here for 4 years. It takes us some time, as you've all been saying, to find these networks, to figure out the processes, to figure out how to be political within a small, very bureaucratic, in some ways, campus. And so by the time you find these networks, by the time you figure out how to engage in work, you're already out the door. And then how do you prepare the next set of students who come in? And I think this is something that we started talking about as well, concern about how do you ensure that change continues happening? especially when you're a student and you're only there for a limited amount of time. I think you have a unique experience because you did come back as a postdoc and a little bit as a staff member. I was wondering if you or if Shelley or Melany, as faculty and staff members who've been here for longer, have thoughts on how to ensure momentum keeps happening.
Yeah, I can maybe start with that. There's a really bad joke in higher education that essentially says, if a dean really doesn't like students and kind of the trouble that they're making, just wait 4 years. Like that's one of the things that I had to learn as an undergraduate, that you are only there for 4 years. And I mean, in Ricketts House, we used to have a joke that says, 4 more years, saying that undergrads will stay there as long as possible. But that's not what you want to do. You really are there to get your education, graduate and move on. I think it was very helpful when I was an undergraduate to spend more time talking with the graduate students, because then they would have a little bit more institutional history. They're not going to be there 4 years, they might be there 6, 7 years. The other thing is that we also learned to really spend a lot of time talking with the underclassmen, with the freshmen, with the sophomores, making sure that we did have that line. So the graduating seniors spent a lot of time talking with the freshmen and sophomores to make sure they understood the issues, they understood the problems. Now, when I came back as a faculty member, as a postdoc, it was very frustrating, really for 2 reasons. One, I could see the same problems happening to the students that were happening when I was a student just 5 years before. And as much as I really wanted to kind of help, it was a little bit disheartening just to see that they were having the same conversations of, how do you keep NSBE going? Why aren't there enough Black students? What do we do to have more Black faculty? And it felt there really wasn't any progress. Now that I've had kind of a longer vision of where Caltech is, it does seem like that there is progress now. But back then, it's just a little bit depressing to say that there were the same types of questions. The other thing is the kind of respect that I was getting from the math department. I had just been an undergraduate 5, 6 years before. And a lot of those same faculty that were now my colleagues were the ones that I was taking classes with just a few years before. I don't think that they really ever saw me as make that transition from a student to a colleague. I think even with a PhD, even having been at some of these fancy places to do research, they still saw me as that 18, 19-year-old just from a few years before. So it was a very frustrating, able to make differences. I helped to start the mathematics club. Kaisa Tapale, who actually was an undergraduate, she and I worked together. I think we did some really good work in trying to make a better community for the math students in the department. But, I really wish that there were more that I could have done in the time I was there.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Melany or Shelley, do either of you want to add anything, or shall we?
I just think Ed's points are right on about some challenges. And, again, faculty have this long life at Caltech, and students have a very short life. And maybe we should reverse that a little bit. But I think, again, for me, I've served in different roles at Caltech. And I think one of the things that is frustrating is that I'll chair a committee. We'll write a report, and that report won't get acted on, and it'll sit there. And then, 10 years later, I'll be asked to chair another committee. I'll pull out that old report and say that, all these things really didn't get accomplished. And, we do seem to continue to repeat some of these things, over the kind of 10-year cycle. I was just listening to the student faculty conference last week, and of course, some of the issues that the students brought up, some of the undergraduates brought up, we've been talking about for years, and yet there still hasn't been the action. And it's similar to some of these social issues that I think there's oftentimes a lot of good ideas, but really implementing and making changes and following through. It's probably not just particular Caltech, but it's an institutional issue. But it's clearly something that I think Caltech struggles with in terms of using all those suggestions, all that data, all that research, all that analysis, and using it to make change. It sometimes just doesn't happen, and that can be very, very frustrating.
Yeah, this idea of the committee model of Caltech, where every time we have an issue, we form 2 or 3 committees about it, and then we go through this, exactly what you're both saying, this cycle of reports. I wonder what it would look like if we moved away from a committee model and we moved into a community model. I hear so much of the communities that you guys have all built and that others at Caltech have built, and how they have lasted, or how they might not have made all the changes we would have hoped in the time period that we hoped they would. But they have lasted and they have created changes. I just wonder what that would look like. Let me jump into another question though. I've been a little fascinated personally with this idea of failure in activist spaces. And I think some of the people who've talked to me lately will know that I've brought this up repeatedly. So I wanted to ask you all to share a failed organizing attempt or a successful one. What were some of the challenges that you faced working within the specific context of Caltech? And then what were strategies that you found effective? And again, anyone should feel free to start us off.
Well, as I said in my little talk, it took years, like 4 or 5 years, just to get the EEO policies changed. And one of the things I've learned over my years of activism is that when one door closes, you cannot just turn around and go away. You have to persist. You have to resist. You have to find an angle to get a crack in a door to walk through it. And sometimes it takes just a change in ownership of a position, whether it be, a Caltech president or just somebody who's just been not allowing you to even speak. I remember one of the biggest changes we had, turns out that James Everhart, the president, actually had a gay daughter. And that changed their mind. And that started things rolling a little bit. But sometimes it takes that kind of fortuitous crack in the door to get heard. And that I have to tell you that my colleagues at JPL were resilient. And, just the fact that they had to go through security clearances just to get a parking ability to park on campus, you had to go through a security clearance. And they were able to ask any question of you or of your neighbors. These were things that we went through, stood up and said no, and got lawyers. And, whether we had to raise money to do that kind of outside thing, or whether we had to just gather around in our teepee and have a fire amongst us, get us together as a community. We had to form a tribe. We really did. And, and I think that that's really one of the things that I learned a lot about when the AIDS era erupted. Any of our leaders were gay men who died. And that's why I had to step up, because I didn't want to see our organization die. I took it over. My wife and I took it over. And we had to nurse our friends who were dying, and people who were staff at Caltech who were dying, that were our friends. That was such an emotional time, and it was such a time that we had to strengthen our spine and say, no, we have to do better. And that's when you get a success story, is at the end of that trail. But there's always the doors that were closed before you got through that open door. I just wanted to relate that.
Thank you, Shelley.
Yeah. And Shelley saying this phrase, we had to form a tribe. This reminds me of a story of something that I worked on very passionately when I was a graduate that didn't work. The minority students at the time, early 1990s, never felt the house system was very welcoming to minorities. This is back in the days before Avery House was even a concept. And, we had the houses. A lot of the minority students were concerned about several things. For example, we really were friends rather than wanted to see each other. But, the house system is almost like a black hole. Once you're there, your friends are there, your social life is there. You don't really see people from other houses. And we felt that that was kind of the perfect way to just separate the minority students so that it really made it more difficult to form this community. The other thing is we were worried about the fact that students were really able to celebrate their own cultures, their own identities and who they were. Tell you in particular, for me, I lived in Ricketts House, and for a while I was really interested in the old Negro Leagues. So I used to wear jerseys that had names of Gibson and other people who were old Negro League players. And I used to have a lot of pictures and posters up on my door, and I would always get harassed about them. People wanted to know, why do you have this stuff? We're at Caltech, we only believe in science and what have you. So several of us got together and formed the idea of a minority student house. We were going to find a house on campus. We were going to live there, and that was going to be a center in which people really just celebrate their cultures and be individuals. Realistically, there were only going to be 3 of us living there. So it wasn't like it was going to be 20 students on campus. Ironically, where the Caltech Y is now, is the house that we had actually chosen. So we have this house. We wrote a very long proposal. We had figured out how many students were going to live there, the rotation schedule of who was going to decide who was going to live there and when, what kind of activities we were going to have. We had worked on this for months and months. And we spent some time talking with the other minority students about what they thought and whether we should go through with this. It was actually a lot of the minority students that shot down the idea. Non-minority students didn't even want to hear it. They thought they were being racist and segregationist and what have you. But I think we were surprised that the minority students really didn't want to go with this idea. So the same students that on the one hand told us didn't like the house system, they thought that it was something that they really didn't want to be a part of. But when they realized we had this alternative of the minority house, they were totally against it. So we had worked hard on this for about 6 months. Literally writing a proposal, meeting with people, having town halls and what have you, but it totally failed. And I still have to tell you, of all the things that I did at Caltech, that's one of the things that hurt the most, was that we could never get that to work.
Yeah, that's a hard story to hear, that again, putting in that effort and having it not work. Again, I think when Niv, you ask, what's been successful, it's probably hard for all of us to really think of the things that have been successful. And again, I think it can be discouraging, but I think we all probably make decisions about what we're going to be engaged in, what we're going to be involved with, because of who we are. That again, when I go back to the story from the late 1980s, I certainly had faculty colleagues tell me, don't do that, don't get involved with those groups. And yet, what I'd say to them is, how do you listen to a student who comes in and tells you about what's happening in a class and not get involved? How do you turn away from that? How do you not react? How do you not try to support them? And so it's hard to think about successes in that way, in terms of kind of programmatic changes. And again, I guess what I think about is more successes in terms of individual interactions with students over time. And hopefully that has a kind of lasting sense of what can be accomplished. Because I think Caltech's a hard place to organize. It's a hard place to make change. And so I think it sometimes is at least easier or more rewarding if we kind of think about this kind of individual interactions and try to move those forward. So.
Thank you all. I want to give anyone a chance to respond to anyone else if any of the 3 of you would like to jump in. But otherwise, I just have one more question that I'm going to ask, and then I'll turn it over to take questions from the audience. Okay. The last question is kind of a broad one. I wanted to ask about the legacies that you all have seen from your personal histories, that come from your artifacts, that you would suggest present and future members of the Caltech community have inherited, and that you'd like to see them build on.
Again, I think that's hard, but again, what I recommend to students is to take notes. Again, I think it really is useful to go back. And again, even the idea about what's been successful or not, at least you've got a trail of what you did, what you worked on, why you did it, kind of rationalize it for yourself that it was a good way to spend some time. And so I recommend that. But in terms of other kinds of things, I think we talked about this book, which again, in terms of the history of women students at Caltech, it's compilation of effort through the author's efforts, Amy Sue Bick's going through Caltech archives and really looking at over time what the process was to bring women to Caltech. Again, I think it's an important story. An important story for anyone at Caltech about what kind of efforts it really took and what the rationale was to decide to make those kinds of changes and the challenges that people faced. So I would just recommend to students to make your own records, keep track. Again, I think one of the things I would be nice right now is that your emails probably contain lots and lots of information, that we didn't have in the 80s or 90s. We didn't use in the same ways. But every now and then I start thinking about, well, what did I do in that committee? What did we do? What was our thought process? And going back through the emails, it has lots and lots of information. So I would encourage students to keep that kind of information too, as a documentation for the work that they did and in terms of improving quality of life at Caltech. So.
And I will iterate that keeping track of emails is something that's been mentioned in multiple, not just in conversations with all the panelists here, but in oral histories. I know Jen Oldham also mentioned how much she wished that she kept her old emails. So that's a very practical and good point. Thank you, Melany.
Yeah, I definitely want to second Melany's point here. I think it's great if you can have the history. It's great if you can document these things. I'd like to think that one of the legacies I have just to ask some very basic questions about the first Black students at Caltech. And I didn't even know until 93, 94 that a lot of these questions hadn't really been asked before. It's not just as simple as like asking who was the first Black student to graduate, but you'd like to ask questions of what kind of experiences did they go through? How did being at Caltech affect them as a person, maybe affect their entire career? And when you start to piece some of these stories together, it gives you your own perspective on the experience that you are currently going through at Caltech, and then what students might be going through, 20, 30 years down the line. One of the people that I see this here in the audience is Bill Hutchinson, and he's an individual. He was a Black grad student, got his PhD from Caltech, was at Caltech in the 1950s. He would come to some of the first NSBE meetings that we had in the early 1990s, and just meeting him, he was one of the first Black alum I had ever met from Caltech. Hearing him tell stories about like trying a grad student living in Altadena because the housing covenants would not allow him as a Black student to live in Pasadena, gave us a completely different perspective of what we as Black students were going through in the 1990s. The other thing is, I'd like to think that kind of us working hard back in the early 1990s to restart the Black Student Union now means that there are these Black organizations at Caltech that are still surviving, still doing well. So in particular, I wanted to thank the current students that are involved with the Black Scientists and Engineers at Caltech, BSEC, and the Black Ladies at Caltech. Also, Sarah Sam, of course, has done incredible work over the time that she's been there. And I'm really happy that she's really taken up the mantle to make sure that a lot of these questions are being asked and that her voice is not being silenced. But it's not easy when you're just one of the few and you're really trying to be an activist at a place where everyone tells you, just focus on the science, just focus on the equations. Don't try to focus on these other outside issues. When you realize that you can't take away your humanity when you're doing science. You are a person doing all of this. And it's just really great to see that there still are these student organizations out there that are really fighting against the mold in this way.
I would echo all of that. I'd also wanted to say, kind of combining Melany's point and Ed's point, as I started collecting oral histories, I questioned whether I should be collecting oral histories of current student organizers. We have incredible current graduate, undergraduate, and postdoc and staff and faculty members of campus who are doing incredible work, and that should be documented. And it is part of the Institute's legacy, and it should be remembered as such. And after several conversations with individuals, I came to the decision that it didn't make sense to record those histories that are still ongoing within the archives in the present day. And so keeping personal records, having archives that are rooted in your communities, within your student groups, is so important. I think it's a lot easier to look at history with some distance between you and the events that you're talking about. I think it's a little bit easier for everyone on the panel and for me to talk about events that happened a couple of years ago or decades ago than to really investigate the things that we're working on right now. So I would really push for student groups to maintain their own records and then to think long-term about ways that those records can become part of the Institute's records as well. Shelley, did you want to add thoughts on legacies?
Well, I wanted to second what Edray said, and that is that when you're doing science, you need to bring your whole self to what you're doing. And if you're hiding yourself in whatever way, whether it's your intersectionality or whether it's just something that you don't want to talk to your team about, you become siloed and you look like a non-team player. And that disrupts the research group. And I think that being your whole authentic self, you can stop using your energy on hiding and bring it all to what you want to do and to be part of your community. And I think that that's really important, because most people say, oh, well, what's being gay or lesbian or trans have to do with science? It has everything to do with how to do science. And I just wanted to put that out there.
I'm going to turn it over to Peter, who's been going through the list of audience questions to go ahead and ask our panelists.
Thank you. So we have about 15 questions that have come to us. There's, I think, a pretty even mix of questions about the past and present. And so I'll jump between those topics a little bit. I think many of the ones about the present are sort of tactical, thinking about ways that the successes and failures of the past might inform strategies for advocacy now. And I want to start with two that I'm going to pair together, one more general and one more specific. The more general is, what changes would you like to see prioritized by the institution to better support minoritized students, staff, and faculty at Caltech? And I want to ask along with that a more specific one. We have 21 incoming Black graduate students in the fall. What do you think, and particularly this question was posed to Ed, what do you think Caltech should do to ensure that those 21 incoming students are welcomed on campus?
Yeah, I have an answer right away. Hire more faculty. Hire more faculty. Like it doesn't get any simpler than that. So one of the things that you learn, not just at a place like Caltech, more generally in academia, is that it's going to come down to mentoring, making sure that the students really feel that they're welcome there on campus. And one of the easiest ways to do that is just to hire faculty that look like them. I think that it's great to have allies, and having allies is important, but the students aren't going to survive unless they do have faculty that look like them and really understand their life's experiences. I think Caltech is doing a good job right now, and that I think that there might be 6 Black faculty on campus. I know that recently there was a hire in PMA in the physics department. But this is still embarrassing when you take a look at the long history of Caltech and what Caltech has done over the years. Like in the math department, kind of my home base of operations, they've never hired anyone tenure track. And I think even over the years, there's only been like 1 Black grad student, 2 Black postdocs, and this is total in the history of the department. I know at other departments, you can say very similar things. But I think that it's wonderful that the number of Black grad students is high this year. I think that the number of Black undergraduates is probably the highest that it's ever been in the history of the Institute. But this is all going to be temporary unless you can do something with the faculty. If you don't believe me, you can take a look at the data from the early 1980s or so. In the late 1970s, you had a huge rush of Black students coming in on the order of like 20, 30 per year. But those numbers eventually dropped off to 0. And then that meant that there were no Black students on campus at all by the late 1980s. I have to chalk up a lot of that to there were just no Black faculty at all on campus. So to me, the way that you make sure that those 21 grad students make it through, and even the undergrads right now, the way that they make it through is Caltech must do a better job of diversifying its faculty.
Any other answers to the question of supporting minoritized students, faculty, and staff?
So I think hiring more faculty is absolutely something that we can do. And unfortunately, we are where we're at, Caltech with I think 6, as you said, 6 Black faculty members. And it's not going to change quickly. And so I guess, besides hiring faculty, are there other things that we can do? And the reason I ask you that, again, as a woman in engineering, I never had any women faculty teach me any class whatsoever. Not an undergraduate, not in graduate school. And yet I had wonderful mentors. They were white men. One was a white man, one was an Asian man. And so though I didn't have women faculty members, I still felt a lot of support from them. They were terrific. They wanted me to be successful. They were supportive. And so I wonder, because Caltech's not going to be able to hire a whole bunch of people in the short time, if you think that can still work, just getting terrific mentors for these incoming students will be sufficient to support them.
Right. Things a long time, and I understand that. I definitely can appreciate that. The question of, well, can you be an ally? Can you be a mentor if you're not Black in particular? What I would say is that works to an extent, but let's take a look at, say, how things have worked out over the last couple of years. So all the incidents that have happened about like George Floyd, Daunte Wright. I can say that when I was a student at Caltech, the big thing that we would always talk about at the NSBE meetings was being stopped by campus security. And it's something where you don't necessarily think about it very much, but I can tell you this was a huge thing among the Black students. You're walking on campus, security wants to stop and ask for ID. You walk into a building, security wants to ask for a campus ID. And it gets a little bit annoying on the one hand, but when it happens all the time, it wears you down. Now that's just being on campus. You then go out into the city of Pasadena, and then you realize that you're being stopped by the police, you're being harassed by the police. I even know that some of the Caltech faculty themselves, the Black faculty, I've even talked about this. And I can say that for me, there was one time when I was at Caltech as a postdoc, going back home. I was actually living at my parents' house in South Los Angeles. And there were definitely crazy times when there might be high-speed chases, times that I definitely was harassed by the police. Well, if I come back to the math department, no one's going to relate to any of this. There was no one Black in the math department. Now, granted, there were faculty that were wonderful mentors and wonderful allies, but just that concept of being Black in America, that's a very difficult conversation to have. I think even something difficult to relate with, unless that's something that you yourself have experienced.
No, I certainly appreciate that. Absolutely. It's certainly not something that I've experienced. And I think it's hard to translate that, those kinds of experiences to people who have. I just, again, just thinking about Caltech right now, it is a struggle. And going forward, it's kind of this question of how do we make it a place that can be supportive. I just recently started chairing a committee in ENAS, and I keep thinking about our alums as well, that might not be a resource for us too. Again, I can think of a number of alumni who, if we could get a little bit of their time, might also help support and be able to engage this population of students and share their experiences as you are doing it right now. Maybe that's another way that we can do it. Just because in engineering right now, we have one Black faculty member and that's it. We used to have two, but we've got one. And is that going to change in the next couple of years? I don't know how quickly it will. And yet I think what we want to be able to do is support the students who are coming in to the extent that we can. So again, I'd love to hear other ideas that you might have. We could maybe do that offline, but it would be great if we can think of other ways to really support these students.
I'll move on to another audio, or sorry, please go ahead, Shelley.
Well, I just wanted to relate something that, in a sense, it's not like what Edray has experienced, but I have experienced at Caltech, being in my own building and having security called on me because they thought I was a man in a women's bathroom. And it took a lot of effort to start having some single bathrooms for all sexual bathrooms, all gender bathrooms. And when I had my facility expanded to the church building, there's actually one across from my facility now. But it took a lot of effort by students and graduate students to talk to facilities and try and move on some of these bathrooms. And I was just saying, it's not like having the police called on you, but I can certainly relate to what you're saying, Edray, because it's frightening. It's frightening. So I just wanted to say that.
I have a question which is particularly directed to Shelley, although I'd be interested in, I think that the asker would also be interested in answers from others. Alumna who is so happy to see Shelley on the panel and says, we worked so hard to build the Women's Center. What happened? And we also have a shout out to Nogglestep in that same question. So I wonder if we could fill in some of the history of the Women's Center.
Well, the Women's Center actually got taken up by Center for Diversity. They kind of, all the offices were kind of put together. But it was a fight. It was a fight to just keep that Women's Center going and to bring in under the Women's Center the LGBT community. And Nogglestep, the National Organization of Gay and Lesbian Scientists, have been fighting for a long time. I think I mentioned that my wife and I had to take it over because the leaders died of AIDS. And we refused to let that go. I am now chair emeritus this year. I've got other people working on it, but we had to really fight. We had to fight for our affiliation with the American Association for the Advancement of Science. It took us essentially 3 years to get that done, and just to be able to present issues to the scientific community from the LGBTQ community. Take our issues to the scientific community and take science back to our community. That's the mission. And then starting up with scholarships. I mean, we have started from 2 scholarships. We're now, I think we've got 11 engineering scholarships available this year. And we've got 6 STEM. So we're expanding all the time, and we are trying to address things. We are working with the administration on getting people to work in the administration, not only staffing, but other positions like Rachel Levine's. So we're on the national front, and that's that's a plus. But we need to, I've been on the LGBTQ working community at the Center for Diversity for a long, long time. And there are a lot of, it's not just LGBT people, but also parents who have trans children. This is a much bigger issue now because people are coming out, their children are coming out, and we need to be able to support them as a community and as an educational institution to educate about these issues. I remember when I first did the first AIDS panel that I think at the Caltech Y actually sponsored it. I got a deluge of hate mail. One of them which said, you shouldn't be at Caltech. Caltech shouldn't be hiring people like you. Just on educating about AIDS. So it's just, you have to be resilient. You have to wear a Teflon jacket and you just have to keep putting one foot in front of the other. And because every day is a gift and you got to work with it. So I hope that answered the question.
I think it did. I think it did. Are there any student groups, affinity spaces, or campus resources that no longer exist, but which you feel should exist now at Caltech?
I would love to see Caltech go back to having an ombuds office. The ombuds person was a neutral office. The idea was to help mediate problems, help solve problems before they got big. We had different people in that role, but again, I think it can be very effective. I think sometimes students are hesitant to go to the diversity center or hesitant to go to the counseling center with issues. Just because they may think that this is an issue that's not associated with diversity, it's not a mental health issue, but just having that neutral person to go and talk to that can help strategize is really important. And I think we miss having that kind of place on campus, for not just for students, but for other people as well.
Yeah, I'm hesitant whether I should answer this question, but I think I'll go ahead anyway. When I was at Caltech, this is during the era of Eddie Grotto. Lee Brown, when he was kind of director of Minority Student Affairs, didn't have students. Basically, you came into his office if you had any academic troubles, but it wasn't a place where you would hang out. As far as he was concerned, if you really needed a place to hang out on campus, you probably shouldn't be at Caltech. Eddie Grotto changed that philosophy. He was very much about having a safe space, having a place where you could literally have barbecues, dinners, get to know other students. And so when he moved his office from roughly a small center on campus, basically where Winnett Center used to be, he moved to an off-campus house that we affectionately called La Casa. And La Casa was the hangout spot for all the minority students. Didn't matter if you were an undergraduate, grad student, staff, or what have you. And everyone knew that was literally a place where you could go from off campus, go to this house, you could be yourself, hang out with your friends, and it was a wonderful thing. Well, eventually that got shut down. It got moved over closer to, I believe it was in the Student Affairs Center. And right about that time, the Women's Center started. So Minority Student Affairs and the Women's Center were both sharing the space, and there was some tension. Because the idea was, yes, it's wonderful that the Women's Center literally had a space where students could feel comfortable. But on the other hand, the space that the minority students had was now gone. I mean, it went from a house to now having to share a floor with another office. And nowadays I do realize that it's very different, that now there's the Center for Diversity. So there really isn't like just a specific space for minority students. But that's something I go back and forth about, like whether we should go back to what we had in the early 90s or whether things are fine the way that they are now. And honestly, I don't know. But that is one thing that I really have wondered about over the years.
Let me pose one more question. This will also be a couple of questions that might go together, and a little more on the tactical side. One is, can anyone be an activist? What personal quality has helped you the most to be able to make change? And the other is, I feel so inspired and grateful. This first part is, I think, a prelude to the question. Thank you for your leadership, mentorship, and commitment. But the question is, how do you stay motivated? So both questions about sort of what you bring to your organizing, activism, or advocacy work.
Well, how do I stay motivated? I see a wrong and I want to right it. I see people who are hurting and I want to comfort them. I see, I get ideas in the shower that make me want to try something. And I think the biggest thing for me is, as I get older and older, I'm not afraid anymore. What are they going to do to me? The fact that Ellen Rothenberg had my back made me feel free to do what I needed to do. I knew I'd still have a job. The fact that my clients in my facility like what I do, it's made me feel freer to speak out and to join the Center on the LGBTQ Advisory Board and to spend the time during the day for an hour with them. That was okay. And I think that just seeing something happen builds your confidence that you can make something happen. But the point is, you gotta just be able to put your foot into the crack of the door and feel like you have the ability to. I'm a shy person. I really am. I don't like public speaking, but I do it because it's needed. And as long as it's needed, I'm going to do it till my last breath.
Well, we have many more audience questions, but unfortunately not time to answer them all. So I think we're going to close out that period of our session.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah.
Niv, do you want me to just slide into my other role?
Let me share my screen. But yes, thank you to the panelists. I think it's very clear to me as a soft and repeated idea that Caltech is a bubble, or that space that's filled with apolitical bodies or apathetic minds has never been true. I think members of the Institute, particularly those within minoritized communities on campus, have always been forging solidarities, and they've always been pushing for change, partially because they've just had to. In order to create spaces that they could safely work and study and live in, these efforts had to happen. And I think this is something that's also true very much today. But I'll go ahead and share the slide, and Peter, I'm going to turn over to Peter to share some resources for campus community members who want to look more into the histories of organizing and advocating on campus. And then he'll be followed by Ed, who's going to offer some reflection on his own work collecting Caltech histories 25 years ago.
So in addition to audience question reader, I'm Caltech's University Archivist, and I brought a few recommended resources for those of you who might want to learn more about the history of organizing, activism, and advocacy at Caltech. The Caltech Campus Publications collection includes the California Tech, the Big T, and other publications that include coverage of student organizing. Caltech Archives collections include records of organizations like ASCIT and the Caltech Y, which have supported student organizing and activism. So you can come to us for help accessing them. We don't have much in our collections from activist campaigns themselves yet, but we're working on it. And you can help with that too if you have documentation from event flyers to websites to meeting minutes. We welcome your contributions to our collections, which could make it possible for future student organizers to learn more about the activism of today. And I should add future staff, faculty, alumni, organizers to that as well. And we'll also help historical researchers understand Caltech. So for help accessing our collections or to discuss possible contributions to them, you can get in touch with us at either of the email addresses here. I'm also happy to recommend published resources, including Girls Coming to Tech, which Melany showed us. But if you have research questions about Caltech history, we're happy to help you understand what might be out there that might address your questions.
Thank you. And I'll ask Ed to jump in.
Hi, I'll just make a few remarks here. I mentioned earlier that I was president of NSBE, the National Society of Black Engineers, from 1991 through 1994. One of the things that we did was we actually formed, I suppose you can call it like a picture book of some of the events that we did. We actually had photos that we had meeting minutes, various brochures for things that we did around campus in Pasadena, and put all of this together into one book, really so that we could pass this down to other students. Turned out that things actually got kind of lost, and that it wasn't until Karina Montilla Edmonds found it again about 4 or 5 years ago. But still, this book is there, and that kind of has an archive of the history of the NSBE chapter in the first few years that it was in existence. Also, I mentioned that I did a surf in 1993, and there I came up with a lot of artifacts from underrepresented minority alumni. Some of them were letters that were sent to me, others were just some photos that I found in various Caltech magazines and other issues. But mainly I'll say that the archival information I had was in 2 types. One, there were oral interviews, and 2, there were written surveys. I'm really happy that I was able to do about the dozen or so interviews with the minority alumni, but I'm also really happy that I was able to mail out written surveys to various alumni. I forget, there are probably about 20 or so responses that we got. I really will say that the challenging part of doing all of that was actually getting the addresses to mail these out to the minority alumni. So again, these are things that I personally tried to do. I'm really happy that I had some training as a history minor, so to say, in learning that doing oral interviews, actually coming up with surveys is not as trivial as it sounds, but at least I'm also really happy that the information is there.
Thank you, Bo. I also wanted to note, in addition to archiving, to collecting oral histories, to writing historical reports, I wanted to highlight a form of memory keeping that current student organizers have built this year. We have the Dei Database, which was co-founded by Tori Lee and Marcus Lee, and which is currently, the database is incredible. It allows affinity and organizing communities on campus to record their existence and their efforts, and then to also share ways that they can be contacted for future collaborations. It's a piece of living history. It's a form of record keeping that simultaneously creates pathways for present and future work. And I wanted to specifically say thank you to everyone who offered their time and their labor to create and to maintain that. I wanted to end this event, as we're coming up on 8:30 or 5:30 for everyone on the West Coast, with a thank you and with a note on community. So I'm going to switch slides. One of my favorite parts of this whole project was when I would talk to someone and they would say, oh, you have to talk to this person. I worked with them, they supported me, they were great, they did amazing work. You need to go and record their experiences as well. And usually every conversation I had, every email that I exchanged with someone, I would get a list of half a dozen or a dozen names that this person wanted to note down as someone that was important to their work and important to them. It made me reflect on just how much labor and how much time and how much care has been shared with me for this project. But also beyond that, how much labor and time and care is shared daily by campus organizers and advocates, by staff members, faculty members, and students at Caltech. How many communities have we built and sustained? I had this running list of names that I was collecting through this project, and so I decided to map them. I decided to show the ways that they're connected, and that's what you see on your screen right now. It's all the people that I've contacted. It's the names that they told me to go and chase down. It's the names that came from that. It's organizations that they were connected through. And there's so many people on this network that I want to highlight. Athena and Greg and Peter, who co-organized this event. Dr. Milton, Rosalind, Chang, whose generosity made it feasible in the first place for me to dream up this project. But I think there's two things about this graph that I'd like to note in particular. First, I'd like to note how many of the Institute's staff members serve as central nodes. They ensure that initiatives that get started with a batch of students don't disappear. They bring in new students into communities that can support and strengthen them, and they consistently push for change themselves. And the second thing I'd like to note is that this network, just within this one project, is a network that spreads across decades. It crosses student, staff, and faculty lines, and it connects so many of the departments and offices at Caltech. I know for me, at least, organizing on campus often felt lonely or isolating, or like you're pushing against an institute that has roots that extend far beyond you and that will continue to extend far after you're gone. But these communities that have been built and that are continuing to be expanded, they last. So I wanted to end this event with a thank you for everyone who shared themselves, their labor, and their histories in this project, and for everyone whose work has gone into organizing, agitating, and advocating at Caltech overall. So thank you all. And thank you to everyone who came. With that, we'll close out the event. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Peter and to Athena and to Greg. And thank you all for joining us.